I used to feel like the perpetual underdog in my own family, since my parents consistently showered my older brother Craig, who is 31, with praise while treating me, a 29-year-old man, like I was invisible. They never hid the fact that they saw him as the shining star, a so-called golden child, because he always performed better than I did back then, especially when it came to academics. They rarely let me forget it. In fact, they kept reminding me that he was leagues ahead of me in school and that I needed to push myself harder just to catch up. Eventually, Craig got into an excellent college, and then around 5 years ago, he hit a major milestone by becoming the youngest vice president in his company's history. He had been earning a good salary right from the time he graduated, but when he reached that promotion, my parents turned it into the new family benchmark and never stopped flaunting his prestigious corporate job in front of me. Honestly, while I respected his success, I had little interest in living the standard 9-to-5 life. That kind of job definitely offers stability and other perks, but I always dreamed about forging my own path as an entrepreneur, ever since I first learned what that term meant years ago. About 5 years ago, after accumulating experience from various jobs in the industry that fascinated me, I finally felt ready to start my own business. My plan was to create modern and stylish car accessories, innovative products that I would personally design, because I had noticed a gap in the market for fresh, cutting-edge ideas. I had put in substantial time on research and development, and I knew exactly how I wanted to structure my business model, so I felt optimistic about taking that leap. However, I believed it would be respectful to tell my parents about my plans before making any moves, thinking they would ultimately want me to be happy and successful just as any caring parents would. I even waited a couple of days after the party they threw for Craig to celebrate his new VP job. 2 days after that celebration, I approached them in person, bracing myself for whatever reaction they might have. To my shock, they barely listened before bursting into laughter, as if I were telling them the world's most absurd joke. They said I must be kidding because they thought it was humiliating that, after all the education I had received, my grand plan for the future was to make car accessories. Despite my clarifications that I was dead serious, they insisted I should not quit my job, arguing that they would be embarrassed to introduce me as a failure. They thought my business idea was doomed from the start and claimed I simply did not have the capabilities required to succeed. Once again, they compared me to my brother, emphasizing how I would never measure up to him. They bluntly told me they didn't want me to fail so badly, and wanted me to keep the regular job I already had. Feeling deeply offended and disheartened, I argued with them, trying to make them see that this venture was something I felt passionate about, something I wanted to pour my heart into. They responded with a firm ultimatum: if I went ahead with this risky new business, then I would no longer be part of their lives because they refused to deal with the embarrassment I would inevitably bring upon them. Apparently, they had been thinking for a while about drawing a line with me if I didn't adhere to their expectations. They laid out 2 paths: stick to my stable job and avoid being an embarrassment, or chase my entrepreneurial dream and make a fool of myself, which would mean losing my family for good. And so, I made the choice that felt authentic to me. I cut them out of my life, fully accepting the consequences of doing so, and I never spoke to them again after that. Unsurprisingly, Craig stood by our parents, although I was not surprised given his arrogance and the way he always looked down on me. None of this particularly bothered me because he and I never had a warm bond, and this just solidified that I wanted little to do with him. I had spent years working hands-on with cars, learning every detail and picking up a wealth of knowledge that fueled my own ideas. That's why I was so certain my custom car accessory business was a venture people would get behind. I went for it, giving my notice at the job I'd had, and diving headlong into building my startup. I'll freely admit it was a hazardous move, and I don't advise anyone else to gamble everything so boldly. At first, I was scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck and relying on word of mouth to build a client base. It felt like an uphill battle initially, but after a few months of relentless work, I succeeded in attracting some investors. Suddenly, the door to my own company swung wide open. The early stages were full of stress, but I pushed on, gradually attracting a larger customer base as people heard about my designs. Then, around a year and a half in, everything began to click into place, and the momentum kicked in. After that, there was no turning back, and my business started really taking off. Eventually, I reached a point of relative comfort. I managed to get myself a decent apartment in an excellent neighborhood, and I drove a car I was proud of. I wouldn't call myself a millionaire, but I earned more than enough to live a stable, fulfilling life. Clearly, I didn't end up the dismal disappointment my parents had predicted I would be, so their initial dismissal of my abilities was proven wrong. As much as part of me wanted to show them directly that I'd made it, I realized it truly wasn't worth the effort. Why chase validation from people who had no faith in me? Over those 5 years, I kept my distance from my parents, never once attempting to break the silence. I got married to my girlfriend of 8 years 2 years ago, and recently we discovered that she is pregnant. It was the sweetest news. Despite these joyous life events, I never tried reaching out to my parents. They knew where I lived and could easily have contacted me if they truly wanted to make amends, perhaps through another relative if they had really changed their minds. From what I heard, they did occasionally ask about me through the family grapevine, but they never directly contacted me. I assumed that was their peculiar way of coping, which was fine by me. Then, unexpectedly, last week, they reached out. The message they sent was short, merely requesting a meeting with me, giving no clue as to why. My wife encouraged me to find out what they wanted, so I reluctantly agreed. When I visited them, I was greeted much more warmly than ever before, which set off alarm bells in my mind. They weren't usually so nice to me, not even in my youth, so I was sure they had an agenda. At first, we danced around the real subject with awkward small talk. Eventually, they brought up the main topic. They mentioned they had heard my business was thriving. They offered a half-hearted acknowledgement of being wrong about me, without actually apologizing for their past attitude, and claimed they were relieved that their initial doubts had been proven incorrect. I really had no idea how to react, so I just offered a polite smile. But then they pivoted to Craig. They told me that his company had taken a big hit financially and had to lay off a large chunk of staff, including those in upper management, which resulted in him losing his position. Apparently, he had been out of work for about 4 months, and he was feeling quite low. That might have been the first time I'd ever heard my parents speak of him with pity instead of pride. They mentioned that despite Craig's attempts to find a job, he hadn't really gotten anything near his previous pay level, and that he'd become too depressed to keep trying. At first, I was merely sympathetic, but it wasn't clear to me why my parents were telling me all this, given that we'd had no contact for years. Then came the real reason. They wanted to know if I would consider hiring Craig in my company. He needed a fresh start, they said, and they expected me to give him a good, well-compensated position, something that would save his pride and leverage his experiences. At that moment, I was practically speechless. Without directly rejecting them or agreeing, I told them I'd need time to consider it. Deep down, I had no interest in letting my brother into my business, but I also didn't want to get cornered in a heated confrontation right then and there. After leaving, I went home and spoke with my wife about the situation. She works at a bank, so while she isn't involved in my company, she underscored that the final decision rests with me alone. She also observed that my parents' motives seemed disingenuous. They hadn't so much as tried to truly reconcile or apologize, they just jumped straight to asking a favor. I had no real moral or business obligation to fulfill their request, especially when I remembered how insulting they'd been years ago. I decided to reject the idea of bringing Craig on board. Hoping to avoid further emotional drama, I didn't inform them right away. However, my parents kept pestering me with daily texts demanding an update on my decision. When I still refused to respond, they phoned me 2 days ago, practically ordering me to give them an answer. Under pressure, I finally told them I had thought long and hard, but concluded that working with Craig would likely be a dysfunctional arrangement. Given our unpleasant history, I simply didn't owe either him or them a position in my company. My parents blew up the moment they heard my refusal. They started yelling about everything they had ever done for me, raising me, paying for my needs during childhood, providing me with education, and implied that I was being ungrateful by turning my back on family in their time of need. I tried to defend myself by pointing out how parents are generally obliged to care for their child, and that it wasn't truly a favor they had performed for me. More importantly, we had been estranged for the last 5 years. They had not invested in my business or offered support when I was starting out, yet they had the nerve to make demands now that I was stable. Still, they wouldn't listen. They accused me of clinging to petty grudges, refusing to set aside the past, and failing to help my own flesh and blood. They even insisted that if our positions were reversed, Craig would have helped me without hesitation, and that they themselves would have supported me if my business had flopped, although I found that claim hard to believe, given their track record of mocking my ideas and cutting ties with me in the first place. The confrontation escalated so much that I finally told them I didn't want to continue the conversation. I hung up and blocked their phone numbers. Even so, I couldn't help feeling conflicted and guilty afterward, wondering if maybe my parents were right, maybe I should have helped my brother. My wife assured me they were simply manipulating me, highlighting how they had never even acknowledged their own mistreatment of me, much less apologized, and yet they had the gall to demand I help them. She also reminded me that Craig had treated me terribly as a kid, routinely mocking me with everyone else in the family. Logically, I knew she was right, but the constant guilt still nagged at me. Deep inside, I wanted to get rid of that inner turmoil, but I couldn't deny how unjustly my parents and brother had treated me for so long, nor could I erase the choices they made. Time passed, and then I wrote an update explaining that I was standing by my decision. I clarified it wasn't like Craig would never find another job, I just didn't want to work with someone I'd never gotten along with. My parents, meanwhile, were telling anyone who would listen that I must be jealous of Craig and had been so my entire life, that I was enjoying the moment to humiliate him and our family. It baffled me how far they were willing to go, sending messages to pretty much every relative we had, complaining and trying to paint me in the worst possible light. Multiple relatives shared screenshots of these tirades, and it was obvious my parents were cold calling or texting everyone out of desperation. Even though most of our extended family knew of the strained relationship I'd had with my parents for years, they were stunned that my parents were dragging them into our dispute to make me look like the villain. Thankfully, once I explained my side, most relatives supported me, recalling precisely how my parents had shut me out and favored Craig long ago. I felt comforted knowing they understood. Meanwhile, I had better things to focus on, namely, my wife's pregnancy and our unborn child. Since we were planning to announce the pregnancy soon anyway, I decided to do it a little earlier, hoping my parents would get the hint and back off. Of course, my parents are quite unpredictable, and I feared they might still stir up trouble even after hearing the news. I wouldn't put it past them to keep pestering me, but I hoped for the best. A short while later, I posted my second update. My wife and I had made the pregnancy announcement on social media. Family and friends from all corners flooded us with congratulatory messages. However, I soon received a chilling email from a suspicious, unknown address. It read that my child would suffer because of how I was treating my own family. It was disturbingly vindictive, and I had zero doubt it was from my parents. Nobody else would spew that kind of venom at me, especially not over something as simple as me declining to hire my brother. Our baby isn't even born yet, and already they're cursing my future child just because I refused to do them a favor they had no right to demand. The whole situation was so horrifying that I couldn't bear the idea of letting my wife see that email. I didn't want her to experience the stress, so I kept it from her for the time being. Instead, I decided to confront my parents face to face. I drove to their house, still refusing to unblock their numbers, and tried talking to them directly. Shockingly, they wouldn't even open the door. Probably they felt cornered, knowing what they wrote was indefensible. Standing outside, I lost my temper and shouted at them. I told them they had no right to target my child with hateful comments, especially after systematically rejecting me for years and deeming me a failure. I also screamed about how they only decided I was worth speaking to once I'd made something of myself, and how they expected me to rescue Craig when they hadn't lifted a finger to support me during my toughest times. I told them they'd gone too far. Their attempts at bullying me into compliance were driving me even farther away. Then I declared I never wanted to speak to them again, promising that no matter how many apologies they tried to muster later, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of forgiveness. I warned them to forget about ever seeing their grandchild. Saying all that was a tremendous relief. It felt like I finally unburdened myself, though I decided not to share the details of the incident with my wife, wanting her to remain calm for the baby's sake. A little while went by, and I composed my third update, noting that my parents seemed to have quieted down after that confrontation. I even held a small pregnancy announcement party at my house for close friends and certain relatives, and to my amazement, there were no disruptions from my parents. I thought they might have given up their campaign against me. But then, earlier this morning, I received an unexpected call from Craig while I was at work. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, and I felt a twinge of dread, worrying he'd also try pressuring me to give him a job. At first, I ignored his calls, but he kept phoning and messaging that it was urgent and had nothing to do with demanding anything from me. He said he just found out about the drama our parents had stirred up. Since he'd been in a depressed state for weeks, he hadn't been checking emails or texts, so he was unaware of everything that was happening behind the scenes. He only just saw the messages from other relatives about how my parents were leaning on me to give him a position in my company, and he was stunned, because he swore he never told them to do that on his behalf. Confused and suspicious of our parents' silence on the matter, he reached out to them, but they denied any wrongdoing, acting like they had no clue what was going on. Feeling that something was off, he called me to get the truth. He was upset that our parents had apparently tried to make him look desperate or manipulate me. He confirmed that he had never asked them to beg me for a job. He mentioned that, yes, he was laid off and depressed, but he'd actually decided to take a break before launching into another role. He insisted that he did, in fact, receive some offers, contrary to what our parents claimed, and was simply waiting for the right time to return to the workforce. Hearing Craig's explanation, and given the sincerity in his voice, I decided to come clean and told him exactly what our parents had done. They told me he was miserable and needed a lifeline, so they demanded I offer him a solid, high-paying position. I admitted I declined them because, quite frankly, our relationship was never strong, and I wasn't comfortable mixing that personal conflict with my professional arena. As I apologized for the situation, I also told Craig I was sorry that he lost a job he'd worked so hard for, that I recognized it was a huge blow to his ambitions. He, in turn, understood where I was coming from and reassured me he had no intention of working at my company anyway, even if I had considered it. He realized our parents had essentially taken it upon themselves to orchestrate this fiasco. We ended up having a surprisingly decent conversation where he vented about the pressure and interference they'd always placed on him. He confessed that the layoff humbled him a bit, showing him how unstable life can be, and I could tell his attitude had changed. We didn't magically become best friends, but it was progress. He apologized for his behavior in the past, and while we weren't fully mending our bond, it felt like a step in a healthier direction. Shortly after that, I wrote my fourth update. Craig went on to confront our parents about their meddling. According to him, the confrontation blew up in a big way, with our parents insisting they were only trying to help him and believed his plan to take a break was irresponsible. Craig accused them of always controlling his life, never giving him the freedom to make personal choices, even now that he's in his 30s. Our parents fired back, rattling off every parental duty they'd ever performed for him like it was some grand favor, ignoring the fundamental truth that caring for your child is a basic responsibility, not a bargaining chip. The resulting argument was intense enough that Craig stormed out and halted communication with them as well. Naturally, my parents pointed the finger at me, blaming me for yet another fracture in the family. They decided to post a rant about it on Facebook, but fortunately, many of our relatives stood up for me and for Craig, reminding everyone that our parents had a long history of playing favorites and being overbearing. The relatives condemned them for alienating both of their sons when they should be supportive, especially when one son had just been laid off. The public backlash on social media seemed too much for my parents, so they deleted the post and blocked everybody in the extended family. Now, they're effectively ostracized by almost everyone. Ironically, this situation brought Craig and me closer. He apologized once again for how he'd acted toward me all those years, and while we're not magically the best of friends overnight, we do plan to gradually rebuild our sibling relationship. For now, though, my wife and our impending child are my main focus, and I'm overjoyed to be stepping into fatherhood.